If you're sitting alone right now, I want you to stop whatever you are doing and listen to me. Not tomorrow, not later tonight, right now. Because what I am about to tell you is not theory. It is not something I read in a magazine or heard from a doctor in a white coat. It is something I lived through with my own trembling hands and a heart that was quietly shutting down inside my chest. I am 95 years old as I speak to you today. My hair is thin as winter grass. My voice is softer than it used to be, but my memory of that night is sharp as broken glass. I was 82 then, a widow, living in the same small house where I had raised my children, cooked 1,000 Sunday dinners, and cried more tears than I care to admit. That night, I was sitting in my chair by the window, knitting something useless just to pass the hours. The world outside was calm. The television was murmuring nonsense in the background, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make you think death had already stepped into the room. The first sign was not pain. That is the lie people believe. Pain comes later, if it comes at all. The first sign was a feeling that something inside me had gone terribly wrong. A cold, hollow dread opened up in the pit of my stomach like a trap door. It was not emotional. It was biological, ancient, a signal from deep within my body that the machinery keeping me alive had begun to fail. Then came the pressure, not a stabbing, not a crushing blow like they show in the movies. It was heavier than that. It felt as though someone had gently but relentlessly laid a soaked sack of sand across my upper chest and collarbones. I could still breathe. I could still move. That is why it is so dangerous. When you can still function, your mind begins to bargain with reality. It whispers comforting lies. It is just indigestion, it says. You ate too fast. You are tired. Lie down for a moment and it will pass. I almost listened. At 82, your pride is a strange thing. You do not want to admit weakness, even to yourself. I remember staring at the hallway that led to my bedroom, thinking how easy it would be to stretch out under the blankets and let the darkness take me gently. But somewhere deep inside, a harder voice spoke up. It told me that lying down would not bring rest. It would bring silence, permanent silence. So I forced myself to stand. The moment my feet touched the floor, a wave of cold sweat broke across my skin. My hands became slick, my fingers numb. My jaw began to ache in a dull, grinding way, as if I had been clenching my teeth for hours. That was when I understood, not intellectually, instinctively. My heart was not just uncomfortable, it was dying, and if I did not act within minutes, I would die with it, alone in a quiet house that would not discover my body until the mail piled up on the porch. That realization did not make me panic. It made me very, very clear. And clarity, my dear, is the first thing that saves your life. Clarity does not feel heroic. It does not come with trumpets or courage swelling in your chest. It comes like cold water thrown in your face. In that moment, standing in my living room with my heart faltering inside me, I understood one brutal truth. No one was coming unless I made them come. The first battle in a heart attack is not against the clot. It is against denial. Your mind will search for softer explanations. It will tell you to wait. It will tell you to sit quietly and see if it passes. It will tell you that you are being dramatic. At 82, I had already buried a husband and 2 sisters. I had seen enough sudden endings to recognize the smell of danger, so instead of walking toward my bedroom, I reached for the small table where my telephone sat. My hands were shaking so badly that I dialed the wrong number the first time. That is another thing people never tell you. During a cardiac event, your fine motor control begins to slip. Your body is redirecting blood flow to the most critical organs. Your fingers feel thick and clumsy, as if they belong to someone else. I forced myself to slow down. I pressed each number carefully, 911. When the dispatcher answered, her voice sounded impossibly calm, like she was sitting in a quiet library instead of speaking to a woman whose heart was tearing itself apart. She asked me simple questions: my address, my age, my symptoms. I put the phone on speaker because I knew I would not have the strength to hold it long. Calling for help, you must understand, is not the solution. It is only the starting gun. From that second onward, time begins to burn like fuel in an open fire. Ambulances are not magic carpets. Even in the best circumstances, they take minutes that your heart muscle does not have. While she was still speaking, I began the next task. I knew that if I collapsed behind a locked door, those precious minutes would be wasted with splintering wood and shouted instructions. I had heard stories from neighbors, widows like me, whose husbands had been found too late because the paramedics could not get inside quickly enough. I would not let that be my story. I moved toward the front entrance, sliding my hand along the wall for balance. Every step felt like wading through deep water. My vision had begun to narrow at the edges, turning the hallway into a dim tunnel. When I reached the door, the simple act of turning the deadbolt felt like lifting a sack of grain. Metal clicked. Cool night air slipped in through the crack as I pulled it open. That small draft of air felt like a promise. Then I turned toward the kitchen, not to make tea, not to gather belongings. I was thinking only of one thing. In a drawer beside the stove, wrapped in the dull orange plastic of an over-the-counter bottle, was a tool I had been told years before could buy time when time itself had turned against you. Aspirin. Not the fancy coated kind that slides politely down your throat. The plain, bitter tablets that taste like chalk and regret. My cardiologist had once mentioned it during a routine visit, almost as an afterthought. If you ever suspect a heart attack, he had said, chew one immediately. He spoke the words the way a mechanic might mention keeping a spare tire in the trunk. Practical, unemotional. I had nodded, then gone home and placed that bottle in the drawer, never truly believing I would need it. Now that little bottle felt like the difference between sunrise and darkness. I twisted the cap with fingers that barely obeyed me. One tablet, white, ordinary. I placed it in my mouth and began to chew. The taste was exactly as unpleasant as you might imagine. Bitter, grainy, chemical. My instinct was to swallow quickly to escape the sensation, but I remembered what he had said. Absorption through the tissues of the mouth is faster. Faster means heart muscle saved. Faster means brain cells spared. So I held the paste under my tongue and let the medicine do its quiet work. People like to believe survival is dramatic. In truth, it is often methodical. With the door open and the aspirin dissolving, I lowered myself into the recliner near the entrance. Sitting upright was not comfortable, but it was necessary. Lying flat can worsen the burden on a failing heart. Every position you choose in those minutes becomes a calculation, whether you realize it or not. How can I conserve oxygen? How can I reduce strain? How can I remain conscious long enough for trained hands to reach me? The dispatcher's voice continued to guide me. She told me help was on the way. She told me to stay as still as possible. She told me not to eat or drink anything else. Outside, somewhere far down the street, I imagined the siren already slicing through the dark. But imagination is not reality. Reality was the heavy weight pressing into my chest, the sweat cooling on my skin, the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Waiting is the longest distance a human being can travel. In those endless minutes, another danger crept in. Panic. Your body floods itself with adrenaline when it senses mortal threat. Your heart begins to race, desperate and inefficient. That surge can turn a survivable event into a fatal spiral. I knew I needed to control not only my actions, but my own nervous system. So I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. In through the nose, slow and deliberate. Hold, then out through the mouth, longer than the inhale. I counted silently, turning breath into a task, a discipline. It gave my mind something to hold on to besides fear. It signaled to my body that chaos was not allowed to take command. The pressure in my chest did not vanish. The dread did not dissolve, but the wild edge of terror softened enough for me to remain present. That presence, that stubborn refusal to surrender to hysteria, became another thread holding me to life. Somewhere beyond the pounding of my pulse in my ears, I finally heard it. The distant wail of the ambulance, growing louder, more real with each passing second. Relief did not flood me. Relief would come later. What I felt instead was a fragile determination. I had carried myself this far. I only had to remain conscious a little longer. So I sat in that chair, an old woman in a dimly lit house with an open door and a bitter taste in her mouth, breathing like it was the only job she had left in the world. And in that moment it truly was. When you have lived as long as I have, you begin to understand that survival is rarely a single heroic act. It is a chain, a sequence, one correct decision linked to another, each one fragile, each one essential. Break one link, and the entire future you are meant to live simply falls away. By the time the siren grew loud enough to vibrate faintly through the walls, my body felt as though it no longer belonged to me. My hands were pale and mottled. My nightdress clung damply to my back. The pressure in my chest had not exploded into pain the way people imagine. Instead, it had deepened into something heavier, more suffocating, like the slow tightening of a vise that had no intention of ever releasing. My breathing exercise became my anchor. 4 seconds in, hold, 6 seconds out. I did not do this because I was brave. I did it because panic would have killed me faster than the clot. This is a detail the world glosses over. When fear floods your system, your heart does not suddenly become stronger. It becomes erratic, wasteful. It begins to consume oxygen like a starving animal. And during a cardiac event, oxygen is the currency you are running out of with terrifying speed. I could feel my pulse trying to sprint ahead of itself. Each time it did, I forced my breath to slow it down. I treated my body like a frightened child that needed firm, quiet instructions. Stay still, stay calm, stay alive. The dispatcher remained on the line. Her voice was a thin thread connecting me to the outside world. She asked me if the door was unlocked. I told her yes. She asked me if I was alone. I told her yes. Saying that word out loud made the house feel suddenly enormous and hollow. But loneliness in that moment was not my enemy. Hesitation was. I remember staring at the small lamp on the table beside me. The yellow light formed a warm circle on the carpet. It seemed absurd that something so ordinary could exist while my heart was struggling in such a catastrophic way. That contrast is another truth people rarely discuss. Life does not pause to acknowledge your crisis. The clock keeps ticking. The refrigerator keeps humming. Somewhere a dog barks. The world remains indifferent while your personal universe tilts toward extinction. A wave of nausea rolled through me, sharp and unexpected. My vision dimmed further, narrowing into a gray tunnel. I realized then that unconsciousness was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching, step by silent step. I adjusted my position in the chair, forcing my spine upright, even though every muscle begged to collapse. Staying conscious is not passive. It is work. It requires intention. I spoke out loud, partly for the dispatcher and partly for myself. I said my name. I said my address again. I described what I felt. Words became proof that I was still here, still anchored to the living. Then came another temptation. The myth that floats through social media like a ghost story. You may have heard it. People say that if you are alone during a heart attack, you should cough violently to keep the blood circulating. Let me tell you with all the authority of a woman who has stared death in the face, uncontrolled, forceful coughing can be dangerous. It can spike pressure inside your chest, disrupt fragile electrical rhythms, and exhaust the little strength you have left. What your body needs is steadiness, not desperation. So I did not cough. I did not thrash. I did not attempt to be dramatic. I conserved what little energy remained as if it were gold. At some point, I became aware of a new sound. Not the siren now, but footsteps on the porch. Firm, urgent, human. The open door I had struggled to unlock became the gateway through which my future walked. 2 paramedics entered, bringing with them cold night air and the smell of antiseptic. Their presence felt surreal, like figures stepping out of a dream I was too tired to question. They spoke quickly but gently. Hands checked my pulse, my blood pressure, the color of my lips. Sticky pads were placed on my chest. A mask delivered blessed, cool oxygen. The room filled with purposeful motion. I surrendered then, not to fear, but to relief so profound it almost felt like grief. I had carried the burden alone as far as I could. Now trained hands had taken hold of the weight. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, the ceiling lights passed overhead in slow procession. I remember thinking how strange it was that the same hallway I had walked 1,000 times now looked like the corridor of a hospital ship. The ambulance ride itself was a blur of flashing lights and murmured medical terms. I drifted in and out of awareness, clinging to the steady rhythm of my own breathing like a sailor gripping the mast in a storm. At the hospital, everything accelerated. Doors swung open. Machines beeped with alarming insistence. Faces leaned over me, focused and intent. Someone mentioned the Widowmaker, that treacherous artery whose blockage has ended so many stories abruptly. I felt a sharp pressure in my wrist as a line was inserted. Then the world faded to a merciful gray. When I woke again, it was morning. Pale sunlight filtered through a narrow window. My chest was sore, but the crushing weight was gone. A cardiologist stood at the foot of my bed, explaining in measured tones that a stent had been placed, that blood flow had been restored, that minutes, those fragile minutes I had fought to manage, had made all the difference. I lay there listening, tasting still the ghost of bitterness from the aspirin, and realized something profound. Survival had not begun in the hospital. It had begun in my living room, with a decision to act instead of deny, to prepare instead of hope, to remain calm instead of surrender. That realization has stayed with me every single day since, because the truth is simple and it is not comfortable. In the most critical moments of your life, you are not just the victim, you are the first responder. Recovery, however, is not the triumphant ending people imagine. Survival is only the doorway. What comes after is a long corridor of reflection, discipline, and sometimes a quiet kind of fear that follows you like a shadow at dusk. In the days that followed, as machines monitored every beat of my mending heart, I began to replay that night over and over again in my mind, not with horror, but with precision. I examined each action the way a pilot studies a flight recorder after a near crash. Where had I hesitated? Where had instinct guided me correctly? What small choices had tilted the scale toward life instead of death? One of the nurses, a young woman with tired but kind eyes, told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Most people don't die because help isn't available. They die because they lose time before help arrives." That sentence settled deep inside me. Time, I realized, is the real battlefield during a heart attack. Not the hospital, not the operating table. The battlefield is your own living room, your own kitchen, your own breath moving in and out of your lungs while the clock is quietly deciding your future. After the procedure, my cardiologist sat beside my bed and spoke in careful, measured language. He explained how a clot had nearly sealed the main artery feeding my heart. He explained how quickly heart muscle begins to suffer when deprived of oxygen-rich blood. But then he said something that made me close my eyes and simply absorb the gravity of it. "You bought yourself time," he said, "not luck, time. You recognized the symptoms early. You called immediately. You chewed aspirin. You stayed upright. You kept yourself calm enough to remain conscious. Those minutes mattered more than anything we did later." It is a strange feeling to learn that your own decisions stood between you and the end of your story. When they finally allowed me to sit up and eat the wobbling, flavorless hospital gelatin that passes for food in such places, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for ordinary sensations. The scratch of the blanket against my ankles, the distant murmur of voices in the corridor, even the faint antiseptic smell in the air felt like proof that I was still participating in the world of the living. But alongside that gratitude came responsibility. Surviving something like that strips away illusions. You begin to see how casually we treat our bodies, how confidently we assume that modern systems will always catch us when we fall. Ambulances, emergency rooms, medications, all of them are miracles of human progress, yes, but they are not substitutes for awareness. They are not replacements for personal action in the first critical moments. When I returned home weeks later, the house felt both familiar and entirely different. The chair by the door where I had waited became a quiet monument to that night. The kitchen drawer holding the aspirin was no longer just a place for utensils and odds and ends. It was a reminder that preparation is not pessimism, it is respect for reality. I began to change small things. I placed bottles of plain aspirin in strategic places, beside my bed, in my handbag, even in the glove compartment of the old car I rarely drove. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. I practiced the breathing technique each morning like a ritual, teaching my nervous system to recognize calm as a skill, not an accident. I spoke to my children, my neighbors, even the young cashier at the grocery store about recognizing subtle warning signs instead of waiting for dramatic collapse. Some people smiled politely. Some listened with genuine concern. A few dismissed me with that gentle condescension reserved for old women who speak too urgently about uncomfortable truths. That is all right. Wisdom often sounds inconvenient until the moment it becomes necessary. What mattered was that I understood my own fragility in a new, uncompromising way. A heart attack does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a whisper in a quiet room, asking a single question: "Are you paying attention?" Because survival, I learned, is rarely about strength. It is about readiness. It is about refusing to negotiate with denial. It is about honoring the signals your body sends before the world has time to intervene. And above all, it is about remembering that the smallest actions, taken quickly and calmly, can hold open the door between life and the long, irreversible silence that waits on the other side. So here I am now, 95 years old, sitting in the same chair where my heart once began to fail. The clock on the wall still ticks with the same steady indifference. The seasons still move across the windows. Life did not become easier after that night. It became clearer. When you survive something that nearly ends you, the world sharpens. You begin to understand that your time is not measured in years alone. It is measured in moments of awareness, in the discipline to listen when your body whispers before it is forced to scream. I did not live because I was special. I lived because, in the first terrifying minutes, I chose action over comfort. I chose clarity over denial. I chose to treat my own life as something urgent and worth protecting. That is a choice available to you too, no matter your age, no matter how ordinary your day may seem right now. Do not wait for drama. Do not wait for collapse. Learn the signals. Prepare simple tools. Respect the reality that modern life, with all its conveniences, has also made us careless about the fragile machinery beating quietly inside our chests. Hope is not a strategy. Awareness is. If there is one thing I want you to carry with you after hearing my story, it is this. The most important responder in an emergency is often the person already there. You, your decisions. Your willingness to move quickly and think clearly while fear presses in like darkness at the edge of a candle's flame. Tonight, when you walk through your home, notice the small details. The path to your door, the drawer where you keep medicines, the chair where you could sit and breathe if you had to. These are not morbid thoughts. They are acts of quiet responsibility toward your own future. I have been given 13 more years of sunrises, conversations, laughter, and silent prayers I might never have known, all because of a handful of minutes when I refused to surrender to confusion. Time, my dear, is always moving. Listen closely while you still can.